So be still, the Lord says, and know that I am God. Welcome to bedtime stories for the quiet men the world set aside, and the reckoning that always finds them. Scripture promises it, vengeance is mine. I will repay. Some debts were never yours to collect. They only have to be paid. So pour your coffee. And let me tell you about the night a man in a charcoal suit was told to wait in the lobby. My grandson's wife had me seated by the kitchen door, table 14, under the service lights, where the waiters come and go through the swinging doors, and nobody important ever looks twice. She had thought about that seat. She thought about a great many things that night. Madison did the flowers, the lighting, the speeches, the angle of every photograph. She was a careful woman, the most careful I have ever met. She never thought about the one thing that would matter by the end of the evening. For 3 years, she had believed she understood me completely. A retired man down in Savannah, a 15-year-old car, a fixed income, second-hand furniture, and a quiet way of taking up no space at all. She had documented everything she believed she needed to know about the old man who came to dinners he wasn't quite wanted at, and left before anyone had to ask him to. What follows is what she missed. My name is James Hargrove. Most people call me Jim. I am 77 years old. I raised the man at the center of that ballroom from the age of 7. And on the night I'm about to tell you about, I drove 3 hours and 50 minutes to watch him decide I wasn't worth a nod across a crowded floor. Stay with me until the end. By the time we get there, you will understand exactly why I'm smiling when I tell it. The evening started the way most things in my life do, quietly. And without anyone watching, I pressed the charcoal suit myself, the way I press everything. It was the one good suit I owned. Bought on sale 3 weeks earlier, the first dress suit I had purchased since the morning I buried my wife, Carol. I polished my shoes with the same cloth the Army taught me to use half a century ago, because the condition of a man's shoes tells you the condition of his mind. And I wanted mine to say I had not given up. Not yet. Then I opened the cedar box on my dresser and took out the bronze star. I hadn't worn it in years. It isn't a thing a man pins on for show. But that night felt like the kind of night that asks something of you. And I have never once shown up to that kind of night unprepared. I fixed it to my left lapel, level, looked a moment at the old soldier in the mirror, then went out to the car. Savannah to Atlanta is the better part of 4 hours up Interstate 75. I left early. I always leave early. I pulled into the Four Seasons on 14th Street at 6:45, 15 minutes before the doors were meant to open. Because being early is one of the last courtesies a man can offer when the rest have been quietly taken from him. A valet I didn't recognize took my keys without meeting my eyes. I have learned to read that look, the quick once-over, the age of the car, the arithmetic that decides in half a second whether you're worth looking at. I've been on the wrong end of it for a while now. It stopped bothering me a long time ago. That night, it nearly made me laugh. Inside, a young man in a fitted black suit stood at the ballroom doors with a tablet, checking names. He looked at me the way people look at something that doesn't quite belong, a flick of the eyes, a recalculation, then a careful, professional smoothing over. Invitation, sir. I handed him the stiff, gold-lettered card that had arrived in the mail 2 weeks before. He scrolled, found my name somewhere near the bottom, and his expression settled. You're at table 14, toward the back near the kitchen. I thanked him, and I meant it. He was only reading a seating chart somebody else had written. The ballroom was everything Madison had built it to be. White linen on 200 place settings, centerpieces full of flowers I couldn't name, that warm amber light that makes every face look successful and important. I moved through it slowly, nodding to people who did not nod back, and found table 14 exactly where he'd said, wedged between the kitchen doors and the emergency exit. Two silent strangers already seated. They nodded. I nodded back. I straightened silverware that did not need straightening. I'll tell you what the back of a room gives you that the head table never will. From back there, you can see everything, and nobody watches you see it. What I saw was my grandson, Ethan, standing in the center of the floor in a navy suit that fit him like it had been grown on him. Easy smile, relaxed shoulders, shaking hands, leaning in to listen, filling the room the way it takes a man years to learn how to do. And God helped me despite everything I already knew. And everything I had already quietly set in motion, what I felt looking at him was pride. Plain and uncomplicated. That was Thomas's boy up there. Whatever was coming, nothing in this world was going to change that. Then his eyes found mine. It lasted less than 2 seconds. I watched the exact moment he registered my face a catch in the rhythm of that easy smile, a tightening along the jaw he got from his father. Then he turned to the man beside him, said something I couldn't hear, and kept moving, just like that. I was gone. Not in any way the room would have noticed, but I noticed. A man always notices the moment someone he loves decides he isn't worth the trouble. I pressed my thumb to the edge of the bronze star and held it there. I had driven 3 hours and 50 minutes to watch my grandson look away from me. And across the room, a woman in a fitted white dress stepped up onto the low stage by the windows, reached for the microphone, and smiled the smile of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times before she ever lived it. She had no idea what I had brought with me. She began the way a good prosecutor begins, with the verdict already decided and the evidence arranged to make it feel inevitable. Ethan Hargrove, Madison said into the microphone, her voice warm and easy, carrying across the room, is the definition of a self-made man. I sat at table 14 and listened. He grew up without advantages, without connections, without a family name that opened doors, or a foundation that softened the hard years. She paused exactly long enough, the way you pause when you have rehearsed it as carefully as the words. What Ethan had was rarer. He had the will to become more than his circumstances, and the courage to cut ties with anything that held him back. Anything that held him back. That was when I understood the speech had been written for 2 audiences. The 200 people in the room and the 1 man by the kitchen door, who was meant to hear every line as the verdict it was. She talked about Georgia Tech, about a company founded in a shared workspace with a borrowed laptop. She thanked the investors, the board, the team. She thanked her father, Douglas Keller, for his wisdom and his support. She did not mention me, not once. And here is the thing you don't know. Yet the thing she was counting on nobody in that room knowing. The borrowed laptop, the shared workspace, the first 2 years of payroll, the runway that kept the lights on long enough for my grandson to become the man she was describing. I paid for all of it, every dollar. Quietly, through a fund with my family's name on it, and my own name nowhere on any paper anyone in that room had ever seen. The company they were toasting that night had been built on the savings of the old man she had seated next to the kitchen. She just didn't know it yet. I began to stand. Slowly, my left knee has had opinions since a training accident in 1989, and it makes them known. I rose 1 degree at a time and reached up to set the bronze star level on my lapel. Madison noticed. Of course she did. She didn't miss a beat. She finished her sentence, turned her eyes toward the back of the room, and smiled with the particular warmth of a woman who has planned for every variable and accounted for each one. Oh, and I see Jim is here with us tonight. Gentle, the kind of gentle that lets you look generous while you cut. Ethan's grandfather, Jim. It might be more comfortable for you to wait in the lobby. These industry conversations can get a little technical, and we want everyone to feel at ease. 200 heads turned toward table 14. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it was not what she wanted me to feel. I have stood in the path of incoming fire. I have knocked on doors and told mothers their sons were not coming home. I have buried a wife and a son inside the same decade and stood dry-eyed at both, because the people around me needed me steady, and steady was what I gave them. A woman in a white dress pointing me toward a lobby was not going to find the soft place she was aiming for. There wasn't one left. What I felt was not embarrassment. It was clarity. The clean kind that arrives when a thing you have suspected for a long while is finally said out loud, in front of witnesses, by the person who meant it all along. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the floor. I buttoned my jacket, one button at a time. I picked up the napkin from my lap, folded it, set it beside the water glass. Then I pushed back my chair and walked toward the stage, not fast, not angry. The way a man walks when he knows exactly where he is going and has already decided what he will say when he gets there. A few people near the aisle stepped aside without being asked. The room had gone very quiet. I could feel 200 people tracking me the way a crowd tracks something it cannot name yet. Madison watched me come. Her face still composed, but a stillness had settled around her eyes. The stillness of someone running the numbers fast and not liking the answer. I stopped a few feet from the stage. I looked up at her. I said it loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. 6 words. Check who the silent partner is. I watched the color leave her face. Not slowly. The way light leaves a room when someone cuts the lamp all at once, with a finality that tells you it is not coming back on its own. 6 words. And the woman who had planned everything understood that the old man by the kitchen door owned the ground she was standing on. Across the room, at a front table, a man in a dark suit set down his water glass and took out a small notebook. The room had no idea who he was. I did. Ethan looked up from the floor. I turned and walked to the doors. I did not look back at the stage, or at table 14, or at 200 people who would be talking about this for the rest of the night. A uniformed attendant held the door without knowing why. I nodded, stepped out into the Atlanta dark, and for the first time all evening, I breathed all the way down. Now here is what every one of those 200 people got wrong, and what you need to understand before we go any further. They thought they had watched a proud old man get humiliated and find his spine on the way out the door. What they had actually watched was the first move of something I had been building for 2 months. I did not choose table 14, but I knew she would put me there, and I had made certain the right man was in that room to see exactly what she did with it. I sat in the parking lot of the Four Seasons for 31 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Not because I was falling apart. I want to be clear about that. I was not crying into my steering wheel or rehearsing the things I wished I had said. I have spent enough of my life in the kind of work that teaches a man to read a situation all the way to the bottom before he moves through it. And the situation I was reading was the particular weight that settles on a man when he has finally been proven right about something he would have given a great deal to be wrong about. It takes a minute to carry, even when you have spent months getting ready for it. My phone lit up 9 times while I sat there. Ethan. twice. Then Madison. Then two numbers I didn't know, lawyers. I'd learn later from the Keller family firm. Then Ethan again. Twice more. Then Madison a second time. And then one more. A number I knew by heart. A number that had nothing to do with my grandson, or his wife, or anything those 200 people thought they had witnessed that night. I watched it ring in my hand, and I let it ring. Not because I didn't want to answer, because I wasn't ready to not until the rest of it was done. When the 10th call started, I shut the phone off, set it in the glove box, and pulled out onto 14th Street. Atlanta to Savannah is the better part of 4 hours when the road is empty. And just after 9 on a weeknight, the road was empty. I set the cruise control, left the radio off, and let my mind do what it had been doing quietly all evening. It went back. A long way. I was 22 years old the first time I flew into a war. Vietnam. The summer of 1971, a base outside Da Nang that smelled of red clay and diesel, and something underneath both that I have never been able to name and would know instantly if I smelled it again. I came home 14 months later with a bronze star, a piece of shrapnel near my left shoulder blade that the surgeons decided was safer left where it was, and one piece of knowledge that has never left me since. Everything a man loves can be taken from him in the time it takes to draw a breath. No warning, no apology. I have built every decision of the last 50 years on that one fact. Carol was waiting at the gate when I landed. We had been writing letters for 11 months, paper and ink, a week each way. She looked at me the way no one had looked at me since the morning I shipped out. Like I was still whole. Like the war had not taken the part of me she had agreed to love. I married her 6 months later in the chapel at Fort Benning. It is the best thing I have ever done, and I have never once needed to think it over. Thomas came 3 years after that, on a cold Tuesday morning in a Savannah hospital. I held him in a room that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, and I understood that this was the real work. Not the wars, not the medals. This small, furious, red-faced person who was going to spend the next 30 years finding out whether his father was worth anything. We built a life near the marsh. Thomas grew up steady and good Carol's patience. My stubbornness, which is a useful combination in almost any weather. He became a man I was proud of without reaching for it. He married a kind woman named Ellen. They bought a house 2 streets over. They had a boy, and they named him Ethan. Then Carol got sick, breast cancer, the kind that moves fast and does not negotiate. She was 56 when they found it, and 58 when it finished. I sat with her through every treatment, every long night, every morning that was briefly better than the night before. When it was over, I drove home alone and sat in the kitchen for 3 hours without turning on a single light. I was still learning how to live inside that silence when Thomas died. A wet night on Interstate 95. A truck that drifted across the line. 2 seconds that erased 30 years of careful work. Thomas was 33. Ellen was 31. Ethan was 7. I stood at a second grave in 13 months, in the rain, with that old shrapnel aching the way it always does in wet weather, and looked down at a hole in the ground that had no business existing. A 7-year-old boy stood beside me in a suit somebody had sized for a man's sleeves past his wrists, trousers bunched at his shoes. He held my hand without being asked. The way small children hold on to large adults when the world has turned into something they do not yet have words for. After a while, he looked up at me. "Grandpa," he said, "when is Daddy coming back?" I looked down at the boy Thomas's jaw, Carol's eyes, a child who had just lost everything and didn't yet know the size of it, and something moved in me that I have never been able to name. Not grief, though grief was in the room. Something older, quieter. Less like an ending and more like an order handed down from somewhere I did not fully understand. I took his hand tighter in mine, and I walked him away from the grave. I had a boy to raise, and standing in that rain, I made him a promise I never spoke out loud. I have kept every promise I ever made to the living and to the dead. Keeping that one would cost me more than I could have guessed, and one quiet decision, years down the road, would end up mattering more than any of them. That decision is the thing she never found. Nobody tells you how to raise a 7-year-old boy when you are 60 years old. The Army had prepared me for a great many things: hardship, scarcity, making clear decisions under conditions that argue against clarity. It had not prepared me for a child who would not eat anything out of a can, who woke 3 nights a week and appeared at my door without knocking, and who asked me questions about where people go when they die that I did not know how to answer. I figured it out the way I have figured out everything, one day at a time, with whatever was in front of me. I learned to cook, because the boy hated the frozen dinners I had been living on since Carol passed. I bought a used cookbook on Bull Street and worked through it like a field manual. I burned a great deal in the early weeks. Ethan ate every bit of it without one word of complaint, and that told me more about his character than anything that came after. By the end of the first year, I could make a pot roast, a passable chicken soup, and a cornbread he asked for by name on cold mornings. When the nightmares came, I didn't tell him everything was fine, because he was 7 and smart enough to know it wasn't. I sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and talked about ordinary things: the yard, the weather, a bird I had seen by the fence. Not because the words mattered, but because a calm voice in a dark room is its own kind of cover. We never once talked about the nightmares directly. Some things between men are handled that way. I sat in the front row at every school play and every awards night. Long after my knees had filed their formal objection to folding chairs. It mattered to be the face he looked for when he walked out onto whatever small stage was in front of him. One year, a teacher wrote on his report card that Ethan had an unusual capacity for patience in hard situations. I set that card face down on the counter and went out to the yard for a few minutes before I could finish reading it. He earned a scholarship to Georgia Tech. I made up the difference because there was nothing to discuss. I drove up once a month for 4 years, brought groceries and an envelope of cash he took without making it a thing, and drove home the same day. I never stayed the night. I told myself I didn't want to crowd him. The truer reason was that I didn't want him managing an old man's loneliness when he was supposed to be building a life of his own. He graduated on a Saturday in May. When they called his name, I was in the stands with a program I had been folding and unfolding for 20 minutes. I did not embarrass myself. It took more out of me than the Bronze Star ever had. Then he told me he wanted to start a company. I asked him one question. "How much do you need?" $1,200,000, he said. I did not react. That was the correct response. I told him I'd look into it, and I changed the subject. That night, I called James Morrison, my attorney in Savannah, one of maybe 4 people on this earth whose judgment I trust without checking it. I told him what I wanted: a way to put my money into my grandson's company without my grandson ever knowing it was mine. He asked me why. I told him I wanted Ethan to build that thing without the weight of knowing his grandfather's retirement was riding on every choice. I didn't want him taking the safe road to protect my money. I wanted him free to fail or succeed on his own judgment and nobody else's. And that freedom would not survive him, knowing whose savings were underneath him. So here is what it cost. The part she never found. I sold the house near the coast, the small place Carol and I had bought to grow old in. The one with the water close enough to walk to. I emptied the savings I had spent 20 years building. The money meant for the quiet part of my life. Morrison set up a company. He called it the Hargrove Legacy Fund. He structured my money as a Series A investment, with one protective measure written into the silent partner's position, a veto, over any major financial move the company tried to make. I'll be honest with you, I did not see Madison Keller coming. I didn't know her name. I didn't know there would be a her at all. But I have spent my whole life learning one lesson the hard way, and here it is. You do not leave a position undefended just because the field looks quiet. A man who has had everything torn from him in 2 seconds does not sign away the last door without putting a lock on it. I signed those papers alone on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Morrison's assistant brought coffee. We talked for a minute about the weather, which was behaving itself. Then I drove home, made a sandwich, and sat at the kitchen table in the house where I had raised that boy from 7 years old into the man he had become. I never told him. I figured someday I would find the right moment and explain it the right way. I was wrong about the someday, but that single clause, one line, in a contract no one in that ballroom had ever read, is the reason a woman in a white dress went pale in front of her entire world. She had researched everything about me. She never once thought to read the fine print. I have met dangerous people. That is not a boast. It is just a feature of the life I chose. I have sat across tables from men who would have killed me without ceremony if the math had called for it. And in my experience, dangerous people announce themselves early. If you know what to look for, a certain stillness, a way of watching that gives nothing back. I missed it with Madison Keller. That one is on me. All of it. Ethan called on a Thursday evening, 3 years before the night at the Four Seasons. His voice had the particular energy of a man who wants to tell you something and isn't sure how you'll take it. He had met someone. He said, her name was Madison. He thought I should meet her. We had dinner 2 weeks later at a restaurant in Buckhead. I would never have found on my own the kind of place that leaves the prices off the menu, because the people who eat there aren't meant to think about them. I wore the suit I'd bought for Carol's funeral, the only dress suit I owned at the time. I polished my shoes and got there 10 minutes early. Madison arrived with Ethan at exactly the stated time, which told me one thing about her before she said a word. She wore something simple and expensive and perfectly chosen for the room. She shook my hand with a firm grip, looked me dead in the eye, and smiled a smile that was warm and lasted exactly as long as it should. Dinner was pleasant, the way first meetings are when everyone is working at it. Ethan talked about the company. Madison asked about my years in the service, and she listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone filing the information away rather than just being polite. I watched her the way I watch everyone in the first hour of knowing them, looking for the gap between what a person shows you and what they are. I didn't find one. That was the problem. When dinner ended, Ethan stepped out to bring the car around, and for a moment, It was just the two of us. Madison set down her wine glass, leaned in slightly, and looked at me with an expression that had changed in some small but unmistakable way. Less warm, more direct. "Jim," she said, "I want to be honest with you, because I think you're a man who appreciates that." Quiet. Unhurried. Ethan is at a critical point in building his reputation. The people he is seen with, including family, leave impressions that are very hard to undo once they form. I'm sure you understand. I understood. I had understood from the first sentence. "I'm not suggesting anything that touches your relationship with him in private," she went on. "I'm only asking you to be thoughtful about the occasions that involve his professional contacts. For his sake." Ethan came back through the door before I could answer, and I watched Madison's face return to warm, smooth, instant, like a lamp being adjusted by a hand that knew exactly where the dial was. I drove the 4 hours home that night thinking about that one adjustment, the speed of it, how little it cost her. After that, things changed the way slow things change invisibly. And then all at once, when you finally stop and measure the distance, the Sunday phone calls we'd kept since his Georgia Tech years stopped. When I called, he was in a meeting, or about to be, or just out of one. He called back when he could, which got to be less and less. The conversations got shorter. The details got thinner. I told myself it was the natural shape of a young man building his own life. I said it with conviction, because the alternative was something I did not want to look at. The breaking point was Thanksgiving. Ethan and Madison had moved into a house in Buckhead that she had chosen and furnished down to the last detail. They were hosting what Ethan called a small gathering. I drove the 4 hours that morning and got there a little after noon. The small gathering was about 30 people. Madison's parents, her brothers and their families. Faces I didn't know who turned out to be Ethan's colleagues, or her father's associates. A caterer working the kitchen. A dining table set for 14, with name cards already laid out. A young woman with a clipboard found my name on a second list and walked me to a smaller table by the kitchen door. 3 others were already there, a great aunt of Madison's who spoke almost no English, an older gentleman nobody bothered to introduce, and one of the catering staff who sat for a minute before he realized he was at the wrong table and got up again. I ate turkey and green beans and a dinner roll, and I listened to the laughter drifting in from the dining room, where my grandson sat at the main table with the people his wife had decided were worth the good china. I could hear his voice every so often, easy, bright, the way it always sounds when he is in a room that feels like his. "I want you to notice something, because I didn't, not for a long time. The night at the Four Seasons was not the first time Madison Keller seated me by a kitchen door. It was only the first time she did it in front of 200 people. I drove home in the dark, pulled into my driveway, and sat in the car for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. That was the night I should have made the call. I should have stopped telling myself the comfortable story and started asking the hard questions, while there was still time to ask them quietly. I waited 3 more months, and 3 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a phone rang while I was fixing a softboard on the back porch, and a voice that was never meant for my ears took the comfortable story apart in under a minute. The call that took my whole life apart came on a Tuesday morning, while I was fixing a softboard on the back porch. The third step from the top had been going for 2 months, the kind of soft that warns you before it becomes a real problem. I had kept meaning to fix it and kept finding something else to do first, which is how most preventable things in a life get started. That morning, I finally pulled the old board, measured the new one, and set my tools out in the thin October sun. My phone sat on the railing beside me. The number that came up was one I didn't know. Atlanta prefix. Nothing saved. I answered the way I always answer a number I don't recognize with my last name, and nothing else. There was a short pause. The kind you get when a dialing system connects half a second behind the man on the other end. Then a brisk, professional voice, already in the middle of a conversation he had started in his own head. "Ethan, I've been trying to reach you since Friday. We need to finalize the language on the restructuring before Thursday's filing, specifically the section that removes the silent partner's veto provision. We've got it drafted, but Hendricks wants your sign-off before we submit." I did not say a word. He went on for another sentence or two, filing windows. A meeting, a name I didn't know. I stood on my porch with a hammer in my hand and listened to every word with the particular attention of a man who has just heard the thing that explains the last 6 months of his life. Then the voice changed. "Ethan, you there?" I said nothing. "Hello." A pause. Then, with the small irritation of a man who has realized he's been talking to dead air, "I'm sorry. I think I dialed wrong. My apologies." The line went dead. I set the phone on the railing and looked out at the yard without moving. The live oak by the back fence had started dropping its leaves, the way it does every October, with the unhurried certainty of something that has done the same job for 100 years. A mockingbird ran through its whole act in the high branches, cardinal, wren, jay, back to cardinal. Nothing in that yard had changed. The morning hadn't changed. Only what I understood about my own situation had changed. And that turned out to be enough. Silent partner veto provision. I was the silent partner. I had been since the afternoon I signed Morrison's papers. The veto he had insisted on. The one I'd agreed to without thinking hard about what it would mean to anyone who later wanted to steer that company somewhere I hadn't approved. That veto made me one thing. In plain language, an obstacle, and somebody had already written the legal sentences to remove me. Not the man who raised that boy from 7 years old. Not the name on the money that built the company they were all so proud of. An obstacle with a clause attached, and a date being chosen to clear it. I picked the phone back up and called the woman at the end of my street. "Margaret," I said, when she answered. "Are you home? I need to talk." Margaret Holt had lived 6 doors down for 6 years. And in all that time, our acquaintance had run to a few words at the mailbox and a nod across our driveways. 2 Christmases back, she had left a plate of shortbread on my porch with a card that said only Margaret, which I had found either admirably efficient or faintly mysterious, and never settled. She was 67, white-haired, and carried herself like a person used to being the most prepared one in any room. She grew tall sunflowers along her fence every summer, the kind that turn all day to follow the light. I had never once thought to ask what she had done before she retired. I would learn that morning, and before all of this was finished, that quiet number 6 doors down would be the one I knew by heart, the one I let ring, months later, in a dark parking lot in Atlanta. Because some things a man does not pick up until the work is done, she met me at the door with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a pen in her hand. She looked at my face, then at the hammer I was somehow still carrying, then back at my face. "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." Her living room was lined with books and arranged the way a mind is arranged. Not a magazine. I sat down and told her about the call word for word, exactly as it came. The way the Army trained me to hold and repeat a thing accurately. Margaret listened from the sofa without interrupting once, which is rarer than most people know. When I finished, she was quiet a moment. "How much do you know about your grandson's wife?" she asked. "Before she met him." "Not enough," I said. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone confirming a thing, not learning it. "I spent 25 years on the federal bench," she said. "Civil cases, fraud, asset stripping, contested estates. The structure you just described, a silent partner holding a veto, and a restructuring quietly built to remove it. I have seen that exact construction in my own courtroom." She paused. "Twice. Both times. The silent partner lost everything before he understood what was being done to him." I sat with that. "Stika, you haven't just been left off a few guest lists," she said, with the flat clarity of a person stating an operational fact, not offering comfort. "You've been identified as a financial obstacle, and somebody has been working on that problem for a good while." She stood, crossed to a desk in the corner, opened a drawer, and took out a legal pad and a pen. "We need to find out exactly what Madison Keller was," she said, "before she ever met your grandson." She uncapped the pen, "And we start today." It took Margaret's contact at the state bar 4 days to find the first one. Margaret had connections I hadn't known about, and knew better than to ask after. She made her calls in the mornings while I sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and in the evenings she came back with what she had found the way a surgeon comes back from an operating room, calm, precise, carrying something that had to be handled with care. On the 5th day, she set a printed document in front of me and sat down across the table without a word. It was a civil court, filing out of Davidson County, Tennessee. The man who had filed it was named Paul Garrett. The date was 4 years before my grandson had ever heard the name Madison Keller. Paul Garrett had been 44, a commercial real estate developer in Nashville, moderately successful. The kind of man who had built something solid over 20 years of steady, unglamorous work. He met a woman through a mutual contact at an industry event. They dated 8 months. During those 8 months, she helped him restructure the ownership of his main investment vehicle a holding company built, as it happened, around a silent partner provision not so different from the one Morrison had written for me. The restructuring quietly moved control of the company's real assets into an entity her family office held. By the time Garrett understood what had happened, she was already gone. The relationship had ended at exactly the moment her presence stopped being necessary. He sued. He lost. The records showed that every transaction had been technically authorized, technically legal, technically his own decision. That is the whole design of this kind of thing by the time the target understands what has been done to him. The paper trail has already been arranged to make him look like the architect of his own ruin. She had not stolen from Paul Garrett. She had arranged for Paul Garrett to hand everything over and sign his own name to each page of it. There is a kind of theft the law was never built to see, because it comes wearing the victim's signature. There was a photograph in the filing. I studied it a while. Paul Garrett looked like a man who had stopped trusting things he had spent his whole life taking for granted. He was not a fool. He was not careless. He had simply been standing in the path of something that had been moving toward him long before he knew it existed. Margaret laid a second document beside the first. "There was one before Nashville," she said. "A property deal in Charleston. Different structure. Same result." I looked at the two of them lying side by side on her table. "She's done this before," I said. "At least twice that we can document," Margaret said. "Possibly more." We sat with that a while. Outside, the last light was leaving the garden, and the sunflowers along her fence had turned to follow it down. My coffee had gone cold, and I hadn't noticed. It was 3 evenings later that she found the messages. Her contact, she would only call him a man who owed her a professional courtesy, had turned up a record of communications between Madison and a number saved under 2 initials. D.K. We were fairly sure those initials belonged to Douglas Keller, her father. The messages began about 7 months before Madison was ever introduced to Ethan at a conference in Atlanta. Margaret read them in order, in the even voice I imagine she used on the bench for 25 years. The first one that mattered, sent from Madison to D.K., roughly 6 months before she met my grandson, read like this. Target identified. Background research complete. Proceeding to introduction phase, I set down my cup. They went on in the same clipped, operational language progress reports, timeline notes, references to the Series A and the anonymous investor who held the veto. Madison never once called that investor a person. She called it the legacy position. I had to hear that twice before the full meaning of it settled in my chest. Then, in a message sent the week after their engagement was announced, Phase 1 complete. Estimated 18 months to Series B restructuring. Then we exit. 18 months. She had set the date she would leave him before she ever agreed to marry him. I told Margaret to keep going. She did. And she came to the one that has never left me. It was sent 4 months into the engagement, in answer to something Douglas had written that we didn't have. Madison's reply was a single line. The subject is emotionally dependent and highly manageable. The subject, Ethan. The boy I carried on my shoulders through the botanical garden when he was 8 years old. The boy who called me every Sunday night from his dormitory to talk too fast about a week with more in it than there was time to tell. The boy in the oversized suit at his father's grave, holding my hand, asking me when his daddy was coming back. The subject. Stop, I said. Stop there. Margaret set the page down and waited. She did not try to fill the silence with anything. That is a discipline most people never learn. I stood and walked out through her back door into the garden. The September sunflowers stood shoulder high in the dark, and the sky above them had gone fully black. I stood among them for a long time. Margaret did not come looking for me. She understood, I think, that some things have to be stood with quietly before a man can decide what he is going to do about them. What settled in me out there was not grief. I know grief. I have buried the 2 people I loved most in this world. This was the colder thing that comes after grief has finished its work, the moment a man sees the exact shape of what is standing in front of him, and quietly reaches for his tools. And by the time I came back inside, I had decided. I went back inside, and we kept working. By the end of that night, the picture was complete, and it was colder than anything I had let myself imagine. Madison Keller had not wandered into my grandson's life. She had found him. She had located the Hargrove Legacy Fund through a banking contact her father kept. Worked out that the silent partner's veto had to be gone before a Series B could close, and built an 18-month plan to make that happen. The marriage was not a marriage. It was a mechanism with a scheduled end date, and a man at the center of it who had been assessed, in writing, as emotionally dependent and highly manageable. I drove home a little past midnight. I made a sandwich I didn't finish and sat at the kitchen table in the dark a while before bed. What sleep I got was shallow and watchful, the kind where the body rests, and the rest of you keeps standing guard. It was in the quiet days after that a memory came back to me. Something I had filed away without understanding, because at the time I hadn't had the pieces to make sense of it. 3 months before the 4 seasons, Ethan had come to Savannah. He didn't call ahead. I was on the back porch with coffee when I heard the front gate, and I came around the side of the house to find him walking up the path in a jacket too light for an October morning, with the loose, unfocused look of a man who had been driving a long time with too much on his mind. He sat down on the porch. I made a second pot of coffee, and we talked for close to an hour: the company, a new contract, the yard, the weather, a dozen ordinary things. He talked the way a man talks when he is working his way toward something he hasn't yet decided how to say. After about 40 minutes, he stood to go. He had driven 4 hours to get there and was staying less than 1. I noticed that, and I chose not to look at it too closely. He pulled his jacket on and went to the steps, and then he stopped, with his back to me. "Jim," he said, "if things ever get complicated, the paperwork you signed still matters. Don't let anyone tell you different." He didn't turn around. He didn't explain it. He walked to his car and drove off, and I stood on the porch watching his taillights swing around the corner, and I told myself my grandson was under stress, talking about something at work, that the long drive hadn't been about any one thing. I told myself that because the other version that the boy had driven 4 hours to warn me and could not find the courage to say it to my face was something I did not want to look at. In the full light of everything I now knew, I understood exactly what it had been. He had known. Not for weeks, for months. And he had come all that way to tell me the only way he could manage sideways, with his back turned. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. There is a particular torment in knowing a thing has to be said and not being able to say it plainly. I had not thought about it kindly at the time. I thought about it kindly now. A man can love you and still leave you to face the worst of it alone. I had not understood that before Ethan. I understood it now. He had warned me the way you warn a person through a closed door, loud enough to quiet your own conscience, soft enough that you never have to watch their face while you do it. Margaret called 3 mornings later. "Your grandson moved money 2 months ago," she said when I picked up. "A significant amount. Come over." Her contact had traced a transfer out of Ethan's personal account, $1,200,000, routed through a chain of accounts that took patience to follow into a trust fund, opened in my name at a private bank in Savannah. He had done it quietly. No announcement. No paperwork explaining why. No record anywhere of him mentioning it to a living soul. $1,200,000. The exact figure I had put into the Hargrove Legacy Fund 3 years before. He had paid me back to the dollar, out of his own pocket, and made me whole on paper. He had done every decent thing a man does, except the one that asked him to stand in a room and say his wife's name out loud. I sat across from Margaret and looked at those documents a long time without saying anything. She waited, which by now I understood was one of the truest things about her. "That boy still has his father's heart," I said finally. "He just lost his spine somewhere along the way." Margaret looked at me carefully. "Does that change anything for you?" I gave the question the weight it deserved. Ethan had tried to warn me. Ethan had quietly moved a fortune to put me back where his wife was working to erase me from. Those were not the acts of a man entirely lost, but they were the acts of a man caught between 2 things and choosing every time. The version of doing right that cost him nothing and required no fight. Doing it at a distance, in the dark, in a way that would only ever matter if someone happened to look. It was not enough. It changes how I feel about him, I said. It doesn't change what I have to do. Margaret nodded once, refilled her tea, and turned to the next page without another word. That is the thing about working beside a woman who spent 25 years on a federal bench. She knows that sentiment and strategy are two different rooms, and she does not let one walk into the other. There was still an enemy on the field, and I had 2 months to get ready for her. I spent 30 years in uniform learning one thing above all others. The side that wins a fight is rarely the stronger side. It is the side that understood the ground, got into position, and made its hardest decisions before the first shot was ever fired. By the time the shooting starts, the outcome is mostly already decided. What is left is execution. That is exactly how I approached the 2 months between learning what Madison Keller was planning and the night she meant to finish it. The first thing I did was call James Morrison. We sat at Margaret's kitchen table on a Thursday morning, put the phone on speaker, and the three of us went through the Hargrove Legacy Fund documents line by line. Morrison had drafted that agreement himself, and he knew every clause the way a man knows the rooms of the house he built. The veto was intact. More than intact. Morrison had written it with what he called belt and suspenders language, 2 separate protective layers, each one strong enough to stand on its own, which meant both of them had to be taken apart before the veto could be removed. Madison's lawyers had been working away at the outer layer, plainly believing it was the only one there. They had never found the second. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole game in one sentence. For 2 months, a team of expensive attorneys had been carefully taking apart a wall, and that wall was the decoy. The real one stood behind it, untouched, exactly where Morrison had set it years before any of them had heard my name. They thought they were almost through. They were nowhere close. They cannot touch the provision without your written authorization, Morrison said. Any restructuring they push through without your signature is voidable. The day they file, I can have an injunction drafted in 48 hours and on a judge's desk within the hour after. They would be stopped before the ink was dry. I told him not to file anything yet. There was a pause on the line. You want to let them proceed. I want to let them move, I said. There's a difference between the two. Morrison was quiet a moment. All right, he said. Your call. Here is what Morrison did not ask, and what I would not have explained if he had. A man stopped before he commits learns nothing, and loses nothing he can't get back. I did not want Madison stopped. I wanted her all the way out on the limb, every signature dry, every witness seated, the whole performance underway before she found out the branch belonged to me. Margaret had already been thinking about Robert Chen. She had come across his name through a colleague, a managing partner, at an institutional fund that had spent the better part of a year hunting for a Series B in Southeast technology. Chen was known for 2 things: rigorous due diligence and a deep dislike of any deal that carried legal or reputational complications, which made him precisely the kind of investor Madison's arrangement would send running, the moment he understood what he was looking at. Margaret made the introduction. I spoke with Robert Chen by phone one Tuesday afternoon carefully, and not for long. I told him I was the silent partner in Nexus Dynamics, that I had documented concerns about the Series B they were preparing, and that I believed a cleaner deal was possible with a different capital structure. If he could be patient a few more weeks. He asked 3 questions. I answered each one honestly. He said he would look into it. He called back 3 days later. He said what he had found was interesting, and that he would come to the launch event in Atlanta as an observer. If the situation turned out to be what I had described, He was prepared to talk about alternatives. I did not tell him which table I would be sitting at. I wanted Robert Chen to see the truth the way I had needed to see it. Not in a document. Not in my word against hers. In a room. In front of 200 people. With his own eyes the moment the polished version cracked, and the real thing showed through. The invitation came in the mail 2 weeks before the event. Heavy paper. Gold lettering. The reasonable thing, the expected thing, was to stay home. The old man who had been quietly edged out simply does not turn up at the party where his face is an inconvenience. Madison had almost certainly counted on exactly that. An absent obstacle needs no managing. A present one is a different problem altogether, especially one that has been paying attention. I called Morrison and confirmed I would attend. Then I called Margaret. "You're going to sit wherever they put you," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And you're going to let her say whatever she is going to say." "Yes." "And then I will say what needs saying." I told her. 6 words. Maybe fewer. There was a short silence on the line. "Make sure your suit is pressed," she said. In the last 2 weeks, I went over the documents one more time. I confirmed with Morrison that the injunction was ready to file on a word from me. I confirmed Robert Chen would be in the room. I went over the Series A agreement until I could recite the parts that mattered from memory. And then I checked that I could. The morning of the event. I pressed the charcoal suit and polished my shoes. I opened the cedar box on my dresser and took out the bronze star, and I pinned it level on my left lapel. A good soldier never reveals his position until the moment it matters most. I learned that outside Da Nang in 1971 under circumstances far more serious than a ballroom in Atlanta. I drove north on Interstate 75 and pulled into the Four Seasons 15 minutes before the doors opened. You already know what happened when they did. What you do not yet know is what happened after. When I walked out of that ballroom, I told you I breathed all the way down for the first time all evening. What I did not tell you is that I was not alone on that sidewalk for long. The doors opened behind me maybe a minute later, and a man in a dark suit stepped out into the night air and came to stand beside me. The one from the front table. The one who had set down his water glass and taken out a notebook while a woman in white went pale at the microphone. He didn't look at me. He looked out at the traffic on 14th Street. The way some men talk best when they are looking at something else. I've spent 22 years in institutional investment, Robert Chen said. I have heard that speech before. Different cities, different names. The same machine running underneath every time. He paused. The silent partner, the woman at the podium, is absolutely certain she can remove. He turned and looked at me then, for the first time. The people who run this play always make the same mistake, he said. They study the balance sheet, and they forget to study the man. I have watched it cost good people everything they built. Tonight was the first time I ever watched it go the other way. She knows better now, I said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it stood in the same neighborhood. Call me Monday morning, he said. We'll structure this the right way. A clean Series B, real capital, proper terms, and not one Keller anywhere near it, not at any level, not in any capacity. He put out his hand. I shook it. He went back inside to finish watching a celebration that had just become something else entirely. I walked to the parking structure and found my car. I want to be honest with you about what I felt sitting in that dark garage, because the honest version is more useful than the one that sounds like a victory. It was not a victory. Not the kind you feel in your chest. I had prepared the ground, taken my position, said the 6 words I came to say. and watched the thing I built work exactly the way it was designed to work. And what I felt was not the clean satisfaction of a job finished. It was the quieter thing that comes after a necessary surgery when the dangerous part is over and you are relieved. And you also understand that nobody can yet tell you what the recovery is going to look like. I have already told you about the rest of that night. The parking lot. The calls I let ring and ring until I shut the phone off and put it in the glove box. The long, dark drive south, with the radio off and nobody to rehearse for. What I did not tell you is where my mind finally came to rest by the time I pulled into my own driveway. It came to rest on grief, not grief for myself, not for anything that had been done to me in that room. I had made my peace with that part months before, at a kitchen table with a retired federal judge. The grief I carried home that night was for Ethan, for the fact that the boy in the oversized suit, the one who had held my hand in the rain and asked me when his daddy was coming back, had grown into a man who could stand on a stage and study his own shoes while his grandfather was pointed toward a lobby. A man who had run the arithmetic in that moment, the same cold arithmetic his wife ran on everyone, and decided the price of speaking up was higher than he was willing to pay. I had no anger left for him. That surprised me. A little. The anger had been real, and it had been useful. And somewhere on Interstate 75 it had finished its work and burned itself out. What was left underneath it was sadder and quieter and a great deal more honest. You can be furious at a stranger. You can only grieve someone you love. I had grieved the dead before. My wife. My son. This was a different animal. Ethan was alive and well. And 4 hours up the road from where I sat, and I was grieving him anyway. The way you grieve a man still in the room but no longer himself. There is no funeral for that. No casserole left on the porch. Just a quiet at the kitchen table that nobody comes to fill. I went inside. I sat down at the kitchen table in the dark, the same table where I had raised him, the same table where I had signed away my retirement for him, and I stayed there a long while, without turning on a single light. The 3 days that followed were the longest I had spent since the hospital with Carol. I did not call him. I had said the thing I came to say, and a man who chases after the person he just confronted only undoes the confrontation. So I waited. I fixed nothing and painted nothing and slept badly. I drank my coffee on the back porch each morning and watched the road and told myself the truth, which was that I did not know whether he would come at all. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, I heard the latch on the front gate. I looked out the kitchen window. Ethan was coming up the path. He was alone. He had come without Madison, and that, before he said a single word, told me more than anything he could have managed in the first 10 minutes. Madison Keller did not send her husband to Savannah to make peace. Madison Keller had never in her life done a thing that did not serve Madison Keller. If Ethan was standing on my path alone, it was because, for the first time in 3 years, he had made a choice she had not made for him. I opened the door before he could knock. I opened the door, and for a moment we just looked at each other. He had his father's walk. I had noticed it from the window, that slight forward lean Thomas used to carry. The way both of them moved when something heavy that wasn't physical was riding on their shoulders. He was wearing a good jacket over a shirt that hadn't been pressed, which for Ethan was the equivalent of another man showing up in pieces. He looked like he hadn't slept since Atlanta and had finally run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. I stepped back and let him in. We sat down at the oak table in the kitchen, the same table where he had done his homework on Tuesday evenings when he was 12, where I had signed away my retirement with Morrison and then driven home to a sandwich I couldn't finish. I poured coffee for both of us. Neither of us touched it. I asked him first. Waiting for a man to find his own way to the thing he came to say is a courtesy, but it is not always the kindest one. How long have you known? He looked at his hands on the table. About 4 months. I let that number sit in the room a moment. 4 months. Before the engagement party I wasn't invited to. Before the launch invitations went out. 4 months. During which he had driven down here once and said one sentence to me with his back turned, and then said nothing at all. And you said nothing. I said, it wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. And I laid it down like one. No, he said. I didn't. I got up, went to the desk in the corner, and came back with the blue folder I had kept there for 3 months. I set it on the table between us and sat back down. I want you to look at some things, I said. Take your time. I had put them in order, not the order that would hurt most at any one moment, but the order that told the whole story, start to finish. The first thing in the folder was a civil filing out of Davidson County, Tennessee. Ethan looked at the name. He looked at the date. Then he looked at me. Paul Garrett, I said. Nashville. 4 years before you ever met her. He read it slowly. I watched his face while he did, watched the particular stillness that comes over a man when he is reading the thing he has been afraid of, and learning it is worse than he let himself believe. He read it all the way to the end, set it down with care, and stared at the table instead of at me. I took that page and laid the next one in front of him. There was one before Nashville, I said. Charleston. The structure was a little different. The ending was the same, at least twice that we can prove, probably more. He didn't pick that one up. Something in his face had gone very still and very careful, the look of a man who has just felt the floor turn into something else under his feet. She found you before you ever met, I said. She knew about the Hargrove Legacy Fund. She knew about the veto. She marked it as the obstacle, and she built a plan to take it out. The marriage was how she did it. That is all the marriage ever was to her. I set the last pages down. The messages. He read them in silence. I watched him reach the line I had sent him there to find Phase 1 complete. Estimated 18 months to Series B restructuring. Then we exit, and I watched him read it twice. The way you read a thing your mind won't let through on the first pass. Then he turned the page. And he found the other one. The subject is emotionally dependent and highly manageable. I knew the exact second he reached it, because his jaw set the way Thomas's used to, and his hand went flat against the table. And he stopped breathing for a moment, the way a man does when something strikes him below the place where words are kept. The subject. He set the page down with the kind of care you give a thing once you realize it is more dangerous than it looked. He did not look at me. He looked at the far wall for a long time. Then he said it. Not as a question. There was no question left anywhere in that room. She never loved me. I did not answer him. The answer was lying on the table between us in his wife's own words. And saying it out loud would have added nothing but my voice to a wound that already had enough in it. What he needed in that moment was not another fact. He had all the facts now. What he needed was a little time to let the whole weight of it travel down from his head to the deeper place where a thing like that finally becomes real. So I let the kitchen go quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, and its sound faded, and the quiet came back and settled over the two of us like something with weight. And we sat there in the kitchen of the house where I had raised him, in a silence that held more than most conversations ever managed to. But I was not finished with him yet. There were things that boy needed to hear from me, things I had been carrying a great deal longer than he had been carrying his. And there was something in the inside pocket of his jacket that he had not yet found the nerve to set down. When he finally did, it would be the heaviest thing either of us touched that day. There are things a man has to say out loud, even when it costs him to say them. Not because saying them changes anything that already happened, not because the person across the table is guaranteed to understand them the way you mean them, but because carrying a thing in silence too long does damage to the man carrying it. And there comes a point where the silence has done more harm than the saying ever could. I had been carrying a few things a long time. Sitting across from Ethan that afternoon, with his wife's words still lying on the table between us, I decided the time for carrying them had passed. I want to tell you some things, I said. Not to blame you for Atlanta, not to make this any harder than it already is. But you drove 4 hours to get here, and I think part of you came to hear them, even if that is not the word you would use. He looked at me and didn't speak. I sold the house near the coast to fund your company, I said. The little place your grandmother and I bought to grow old in. The one with the water close enough to walk to. I cashed in the savings I had been building for 20 years, every dollar I set aside for the quiet part of my life, and I put it into the Hargrove Legacy Fund. Because you were Thomas's son, and Thomas never got the chance to build a single thing that outlasted him. And I wanted you to have what he didn't. I let that sit a moment. Some things need a little air around them. I didn't tell you, because I wanted you free to build it without the weight of knowing whose retirement was riding on it. I didn't want you taking the careful road to protect an old man's money. I wanted you betting on your own judgment and nobody else's. I still believe that was right. I looked at him steady. I'm not asking you to feel guilty about any of it. I'm telling you so you know the whole picture. His hands were flat on the table. He was listening the way a man listens when he understands that what is being said matters too much to interrupt. The Thanksgiving before last, I said. I drove 4 hours up there because you told me it was a small gathering. They sat me at a folding table by the kitchen door next to a woman I was never introduced to, and a caterer who sat down by accident and got up when he realized his mistake. I ate my turkey, and I listened to you laughing in the next room with the people your wife had decided were worth the good china. Then I drove 4 hours home, and I sat in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I never told you that. Something moved across his face. He looked at the table. I'm not telling you to wound you, I said. I'm telling you because you need to see the real price of what happened to us. Not the polished version, not the one I filtered through 30 years of learning how to be useful and never difficult. The real figures. A man has to see the real figures before he understands what a thing truly cost him. The kitchen had gone dim. I hadn't turned on a light, and the lamp on the counter laid a narrow warmth across the table between us. There's one more thing, I said. I told him about the day we buried his father. The rain. The old shrapnel aching the way it does in wet weather. The feeling of standing at a second grave in 13 months and understanding that the two people who made it worth standing up straight were both in the ground. And the promise I made there, not out loud, not in any words, but the way a man commits to a thing in the silence of his own head and then holds himself to it without needing a witness. I promised your father I would make sure his son knew what it meant to be a man who keeps his word. I said, not that I would hand you money, or comfort, or an easy road. That I would show you what keeping your word looks like even when it costs you, even when nobody who matters is watching. I held his eyes. That was the promise. I meant to keep it. I still do. I had said what needed saying. I stopped. Ethan sat with it a long while. His eyes were bright in the way that does not always mean tears, but lives on the same street. He didn't look straight at me, and I didn't ask him to. After a while, he said, "I know nothing I say tonight is enough." "No," I said. "But you're here. That counts for something. It was not absolution. And I want to be clear about that. A man does not get to drive 4 hours and set a hard drive on a table and call the account settled. But showing up is the first thing, the thing everything else has to stand on. And after 3 years, he had finally done the first thing. He nodded. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out the thing he had been carrying, a small USB drive. He set it on the table between us with the deliberate care of a man laying down something that cost him to put down. 6 months of recordings, he said. Everything she said when she thought she was safe. I started it once I understood what she was planning, and I couldn't find the courage to stop her any other way. He looked at me directly the first time all afternoon. I kept telling myself there was still time to handle it differently. I picked up the drive and held it in my hand. "I know how that sounds," he said. "I know how it sounds too," I said. "I'm going to listen to it anyway." I carried the drive to the old laptop on the kitchen desk and plugged it in. And while it loaded, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, looking at nothing in particular. Giving myself one last moment before whatever was on that drive became something I could not unknow. Ethan sat at the table and said nothing. He had the stillness of a man who has set down the thing he came to set down and is waiting to learn what it will cost him. I sat at the desk and put the earphones in. The first file was dated 6 months back. I pressed play. Madison's voice came through clean, no background noise behind it, which told me Ethan had been careful about how he recorded. She was on the phone with her father. I could tell from the cadence and the shorthand. She had the quality I had first noticed across that restaurant table in Buckhead. The one I couldn't name then and could name now without any trouble at all. She was efficient. Every sentence she spoke moved toward a purpose, and not one word in it was wasted. She was walking through the Series A timeline. She used the phrase legacy position twice inside a minute each time, the way you would refer to something that needs scheduling, rather than something that needs considering. She mentioned the launch event, called it a milestone, and then, in a voice that carried no more weight than a man reading off a delivery date, she said the rest of it, that the holder of the legacy position was elderly and in ordinary health. That actuarial probability suggested a natural resolution within a workable time frame, should the legal restructuring run into complications, and that either outcome served the plan equally well. Natural resolution. I listened to those 2 words exactly 1 time. Then I took the earphones out, closed the laptop, and sat a moment with both hands flat on the desk. She had accounted for my death. She had built it into the plan as a fallback, a second road to the same place. And she had done it without a flicker of anything you could call feeling. Not hatred. Hatred would have been almost human. She discussed my dying with the same flat practicality she brought to a capital structure or a filing deadline. I was a line item, and she had written herself a contingency for each of the 2 ways a line item gets cleared off a page. I stood, carried my coffee back to the table, and sat down across from my grandson. "How much of it have you heard?" I asked. "All of it," he said. "More than once." "Then you know what's on it?" "Yes," he said. "I know." We sat with that a moment. There was nothing worth adding to it. "Here is what is going to happen," I said. I kept my voice level, because that moment did not call for anything but precision. The Series B her people have been building is not going to close. The veto I hold under the Series A is intact, and I am going to use it. I have already spoken to another investor, a serious one, who will put together a clean Series B with no Keller anywhere near it. The company you built is sound. Ethan, what was done to it was not your doing, and it does not have to be what Nexus Dynamics becomes. But that is going to take you making some decisions clearly with your own counsel. Not one soul connected to Madison or to her father. "I understand," he said. "You read the Series A yourself," I said. "The whole document. Not a summary from somebody else's lawyer. Then make the right decision." I looked at him. "I will know if you did." He nodded once. The kitchen was full dark outside now. The lamp on the counter held its narrow circle of light over the 2 of us, and I could feel the weight of everything that had been said settling into the room, the way heavy things settle slow and complete, and past the point of being taken back. "What about us?" he said. It was the question I had known was coming since the moment he sat down. He had been holding it the whole afternoon, setting it aside each time something more specific needed handling. And now the specific things were finished, and only the large one was left. "Go home," I said. "Handle the legal end with your own counsel. Make the decisions because they're right, not because of what you think I want from you. And after that, you are going to have to decide what kind of man you intend to be. Not for me, for yourself, and for your father. And after I decide," he said, quietly, "what happens with us?" I looked at him a long moment across that table. The boy in the oversized suit. The man who had carried a recording in his jacket because it was the only kind of courage he had been able to manage. It was not the courage I would have chosen for him. But it was real, and it had cost him. And I did not throw it away. "That's up to you," I said. "It always was." He held my eyes. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and picked up his keys. He stopped at the threshold a moment, his back to me, and said nothing. I did not need him to. The door opened and closed. His footsteps crossed the porch. His car started in the street and pulled away. I sat alone in the lamplight. Some silences need time before you can hear what is underneath them. I was willing to give this one whatever it asked. And on Monday morning, I was going to begin taking the whole thing apart. Robert Chen was exactly the kind of man Madison Keller had been counting on not to exist. She had built her whole approach on one assumption, that the silent partner behind the Hargrove Legacy Fund was a clueless old man. Somebody who could be embarrassed into stepping aside, or quietly steered into irrelevance before he understood what was being done to him. Somebody with no real connections and no real teeth. She had been thorough about it. She had researched me carefully and completely. She had simply researched the wrong version of me. I called Robert Chen at 9 o'clock Monday morning, from my kitchen in Savannah. The conversation was shorter than I expected. His people had spent the weekend going through the Series A line by line, confirming the veto, and sketching out exactly what a clean Series B would need with his firm leading it. By the time I called, he was already there. I called Morrison the moment I hung up and told him to file. The veto notice went out before noon. Madison's attorneys were informed, in plain legal language, that the restructuring they had been preparing was void, that any move toward a Series B would require the written consent of the Hargrove Legacy Fund, and that no such consent would be coming not under the existing terms, and not under any terms that put a Keller anywhere inside the deal. Morrison told me later that the reply from her counsel was brief and offered nothing that amounted to a real objection. That is the thing about a plan built entirely on the target staying blind. It has no second wall to fall back behind. The moment the target shows he has been watching the whole time, there was no drama in any of it. And I want you to understand that. After 2 months of preparation after a misdialed phone call, and a federal judge's kitchen table, and a folder I had kept in a desk drawer, the actual undoing of Madison Keller's plan took 3 phone calls and most of one morning. That is what preparation buys a man. The fight is decided long before the first punch is ever thrown. By the time you move, all that is left to do is the paperwork. The Series B closed 3 weeks later, with Robert Chen's firm as lead investor. The terms were clean, the structure was sound, and there was not a Keller in any line of it. Nexus Dynamics would go on. Whatever my grandson chose to build from there was his to build. I learned about Madison's divorce filing through Morrison, who kept a contact at the Fulton County Courthouse. She filed exactly 1 week after the launch event. Irreconcilable differences, incompatibility of long-term goals. It was the legal translation of a plan that had failed and an exit that had been written long in advance and needed only a date typed into the blank. Knowing what I knew about how that woman operated, the language was probably more honest than she meant it to be. She never called me, not once, through any of it. No threat, no plea, no explanation, no apology. I had expected at least one of those. It is the human reflex, to reach for the person you have wronged and try to bend the story back into a shape you can live with. Madison did not have that reflex. To the very end, I stayed exactly what I had always been to her, a line item. Now resolved. Douglas Keller's firm pulled out of every part of Nexus Dynamics within 48 hours of Morrison's notice. No statement, no explanation, no counteroffer. They simply removed themselves from every channel tied to the company. With the smooth efficiency of people who know exactly how to limit their exposure the instant a thing stops being profitable. That speed told me the last thing I needed to know about Douglas Keller. He had known what his daughter was doing. He had built the machinery she ran it on. And when it came apart, he moved like a man who had planned his own way out right alongside hers. They were not a father and daughter who had lost their way together. They were 2 people who ran the same play, folded the same hand, and walked away from the same table without once looking back at the man still sitting at it. I told Margaret all of it over coffee at her kitchen table, the week after the Series B closed. She listened the way she always did, with the full, undivided attention of a woman who had spent 25 years learning that what you hear depends entirely on the quality of the silence you bring to the hearing. When I finished, she refilled her tea and looked at me. "Are you relieved?" she asked. I thought about it, the way her questions tended to require. For Ethan, yes, I said. The company is intact. The structure is honest. What it becomes now depends on the choices he makes, which is how it should have been from the start. That part relieves me. I paused. For myself, I stopped needing relief the night I walked out of that ballroom. What I feel now is mostly the particular tiredness that comes when a long thing is finally finished. Margaret nodded. She looked out her window at the sunflowers, gone to seed in October, standing bare-stalked and tall in the thin morning light. You did what you set out to do, she said. Yes, and the rest of it is waiting. Yes, I said. The rest of it is waiting. She showed me a short item in the Atlanta business pages about the Series B closing. 3 paragraphs. My name was nowhere in it, which was exactly as it should be. There was only one thing left that I could not reach with a veto, or a clean deal, or a plan laid down 2 months in advance. I had been able to take apart everything Madison Keller built. I could not decide what my grandson would choose to become on the other side of it. That had never been mine to decide. Margaret called me at 7 in the morning. She only ever called that early when something mattered. I walked down the street in the October cold with my coffee still in my hand. And she met me at the door the way she always did, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a pen somewhere in her grip, the look of a woman pulled out of the middle of something. She didn't waste time with preamble. She slid a stack of printed pages across the kitchen table and let me read. Ethan had read the Series A agreement, not a summary, not a digest prepared by somebody else's attorney. The full document, every page of it. He had retained his own independent counsel, a corporate lawyer in Atlanta with no thread connecting him to Madison or to Douglas Keller, and he had cooperated, fully and without reservation, with Robert Chen's firm through the entire remainder of the Series B. Every document Morrison asked for, he provided, promptly and completely. Every question put to him, he answered straight. There had been no attempt to negotiate terms that favored him at the company's expense. No effort to save any scrap of Madison's original plan. No condition attached to a single thing he did. He had done what needed doing without being asked twice, and without trying to pull $1 out of it for himself. He had made the right decision. I want to tell you, I felt vindicated reading it. But that is not the word for it. What I felt was closer to relief, the kind that comes loose in your chest before you have given it permission to. I had set that boy a test in my dark kitchen. Read the document yourself. Make the right call. I will know if you did. And he had passed it the hard way alone, with no one standing over him to hand out credit for it. That is the only way a test like that ever means a thing. I read the report through twice and set it down on the table. Akuku. There's one more thing, Margaret said. She turned to the last page and put her finger on a short paragraph near the bottom, a note from Morrison, confirming that the trust fund transfer, the one Ethan had made 2 months before the Four Seasons, was still intact and untouched. $1,200,000 in my name, sitting exactly where he had quietly placed it. He could have taken it back. The danger had passed. The marriage was finished, and not a soul would have known or asked. A weaker man, a colder one, would have quietly reversed the transfer and called it prudence. Ethan left it where it sat. He had given me back my retirement, to the dollar, and then turned down every chance to take it again. There are men who pay a debt only as long as someone is watching them pay it. My grandson, it turned out, was not one of those men. I looked at that paragraph a while without saying anything. Ethan had cooperated when it finally counted. He had also, 2 months before there was a single visible consequence to fear, moved his own money in the dark to protect a man he had failed to protect in the light. Both of those things were true at the same time. and neither one canceled the other. I have learned that most honest accounts of a person are built that way out of pieces that don't quite square against each other, that ask you to hold the contradiction without forcing it to resolve. A coward and a son, a man who looked away on a stage, and a man who emptied his own savings into a trust with his grandfather's name on it. Both. At once. He still has his father's heart, I said. Margaret looked at me. Is that enough? I don't know yet, I said. But it is something real. And after these last few months, I have come to set a high price on the things that are real. We finished our coffee. Outside, the bare sunflower stalks stood along her fence like sentries who had stayed at their posts long after the season they were guarding had ended. Ethan and I had not spoken since the afternoon at my kitchen table. He had gone home and done every hard, quiet, correct thing without once calling to tell me he was doing it. I took that as its own kind of answer. A man who wants credit picks up the phone. He was letting the work speak instead the way I had tried to teach him a long time ago, at a table not so different from this one. What will you do now? Margaret asked. I thought about the fence Ethan and I had built together the summer he turned 14, the one that had needed paint for 2 years. The one I had been walking past every single morning without stopping. I'm going to paint the fence, I said. She looked at me. That's it. That's enough for today, I said. She made the small sound that was the nearest thing she had to a laugh. We finished what was in our cups, and I walked home up the cold street. And for the first time in longer than I could measure, I was not walking toward a problem. I had spent the better part of a year braced. A man doesn't notice how long he has been carrying a thing until he finally sets it down and feels his shoulders come up an inch on their own. Mine came up that morning on a cold street in Savannah with an empty cup in my hand. What I did not know, what I would not know for another 6 months, was that the house I was walking home to had been holding something for me all that time. Something with my son's name written on it, in my own hand. Waiting in a drawer I had not opened in years. It would wait a little longer. It had learned how. The 6 months that followed were the quietest I had known since before Carol got sick. I started with the fence. It was the one Ethan and I had built together the summer he turned 14, the one that had needed paint for 2 years while I walked past it every morning, finding other things to do. I worked from the far end toward the house, one section each morning in the thin November light, taking my time with the corners and the grain the way my own father had taught me when I was young, and still believed that most things worth doing deserved the right amount of time. I remembered the Saturday we built it. Ethan complained for the first 2 hours, with the full theatrical despair only a 14-year-old boy can manage. Then something turned in him around midday, and he worked steady and well right through to the end. And when we finished, he stood back and looked at it with the quiet pride of a boy who does not want to admit that the thing he complained about turned out to be exactly what he needed. I painted slow, and I let myself remember it, and I did not rush toward anything else. There was something fitting in the work that I did not examine too closely while I did it. The two of us had built that fence together, and now I was making it whole again, alone, one board at a time. A man my age learns not to lean too hard on a thing like that. But he notices it. He lets it sit in the back of his mind while his hands stay busy in some mornings. That is about as close to prayer as he gets. I drank my coffee on the back porch in the mornings, before the day asked anything in particular of me. There was a mockingbird that worked the oak tree most days, and I gave him a name, which is not the same as knowing a thing, but serves a similar purpose. I went back to the cookbook I had bought the first year I was raising Ethan, the one I had started and never finished, and I worked through the rest of it. With no urgency and no audience but myself. Margaret and I had coffee 2 or 3 mornings a week, and as the legal business receded, our talk wandered further from the practical. She told me about the cases that had stayed with her across 25 years on the bench, the ones she was proud of, and the 1 or 2 she was not. I told her about the postings that had been worth the cost, and the ones that had not. Some mornings we said nothing of any consequence at all, for the plain pleasure of having a person on the other side of the table who wasn't managing anything and wasn't asking a thing of you in return. I had not understood, until that autumn, how much of my life had been spent inside a silence I never chose, one that had only accumulated, year on year, through circumstance. There is a wide difference between the quiet a man chooses and the silence that simply settles on him. I was grateful, late as it was, to finally learn it. Ethan and I did not talk in those months. Not out of anger, the anger was long spent, but because some things need room before they can be picked back up. And we were both, I think, giving the other that room. Once, in December, a card arrived in the mail with no note inside it. Only his name at the bottom. I set it on the mantel and left it there. I understood it for exactly what it was. He was not gone. He was waiting. The same as I was. In the evenings, after dinner, I wrote. Not for anyone. Notes to myself about Carol, about Thomas, about the things I had understood too late and the few I had gotten right. About what I would say to the 2 of them, if the saying were still possible. One night I wrote a full page to Carol, apologizing for the 3 hours I had spent alone in a dark kitchen the evening she died, instead of turning on a light and calling our son. About the particular quality of the late afternoon light in that kitchen, which was the same light I remembered from the evenings Ethan did his homework at the table when he was 10, and the same light from 30 years before that, when it had been only Carol and me, and the whole of it was still out ahead of us. Writing does not change what happened. I know that. But it gives a thing a place to exist outside the room, inside a man, where it has been sitting all along, unacknowledged, taking up space he needed for other things. I found that useful. And then, one evening in early October, most of a year after that night at the Four Seasons, I opened the bottom drawer of the desk to look for something else entirely. It was near the back, under papers I had not sorted in years. A plain envelope, yellowed a little at the edges, the kind that does not survive a long time particularly well, but had somehow survived these years anyway. There was a single word on the front, in my own handwriting, from a much younger version of my hand, Thomas. I sat down with it in my hands, and for a long moment I did not open it. Some envelopes a man has to sit with before he is ready to break the seal, because you know. The way you know certain things in your chest before your mind has caught up, that whatever is folded inside is going to ask something of you. Outside, the last of the light was going out of the yard, and I understood, holding it, that opening this envelope was going to finish something I had started 15 years ago, and that before it was done, it was going to bring my grandson back up my front path one more time. The letter was written on paper that had yellowed at the edges, in handwriting from a different season of my life, when the hand that held the pen carried a different weight than it does now. I sat with it a moment before I opened it. the way a man sits before doing a thing that cannot be undone. Then I opened it, one page. I had written it the week after we buried Thomas, at this same desk, at some hour of the night, when sleep had stopped being available, and I needed to do something that did not require me to speak. I hadn't known, at the time, whether I meant to keep it. I kept it 15 years without ever deciding to, which is sometimes how the important things survive. Not through intention, through simply never being thrown away. I had written to my son the way a man writes when he isn't sure anyone is listening, but feels he has to try regardless. I told him I did not know how to do what I was about to attempt. That 30 years in the Army had taught me to manage large problems with too few resources, and that a 7-year-old boy who had just lost both his parents was a different category of difficulty than anything they had trained me for. I told him the boy had Carol's eyes, which was something I had not been ready for, and that every time I looked at him, I saw things that helped and things that made it harder. I told him I would do my best by him and hold myself to it, whether anyone was watching or not. And near the bottom of the page, I had written the line I would speak out loud to Ethan in my kitchen, almost a year before. I promise I will make sure your son knows what it means to be a man who keeps his word. I read that sentence twice. Then I set the letter down on the desk, and I looked at the watch on my left wrist. Thomas bought that watch the year he turned 25. With the first real paycheck from a job he had worked toward since high school. A simple watch, well made. The kind that does not call attention to itself, but keeps good time for decades without asking for much. He was wearing it the morning of the accident on Interstate 95. They gave it to me at the hospital with his things, and I put it on that same evening and had not taken it off since. 15 years, through more ordinary mornings than I cared to count. I slid it off and held it in my palm. It was lighter than I expected, which struck me as strange, given how completely I had felt its weight over 15 years. The back was plain, uninscribed. Thomas had bought it for practical reasons and never once saw the need to add sentiment to a thing that was already doing its job. That was him. Exactly. I carried it into the bedroom and set it in the cedar box on the dresser, beside the bronze star. Then I stood a moment in the quiet of the house. I knew Ethan would call. Not when, but I had understood, since the afternoon at the kitchen table, that there was a thing between us that needed one more visit. Something that could not be done over a phone or a letter. Something that needed the plain weight of a man being in the room. He called on a Saturday morning in October while I was reading the paper. "Jim," he said, "I'm in Savannah. Can I come by?" "Yes," I said. He arrived 20 minutes later. I heard the gate and came around the house to meet him on the path. He was wearing a jacket that fit him right. He looked like a man who had made the decisions that needed making and found ground on the other side of them not healed. Exactly, but located. Standing somewhere specific. Instead of between things, he stopped at the front walk and looked at the fence. "You repainted it," he said. "It needed it," I said. He looked at it another moment, and I watched him place it the fence we built together when he was 14, fresh now in the morning light. He didn't say anything more. That was the right instinct. "Come to the door," I said. He waited on the porch while I went back to the bedroom for the cedar box. The October light was the clear, level gold of a coastal Georgia morning, and it lay across the porch boards in long, bright stripes. I held the box out to him. He looked at it, then he looked at me. Your father wanted you to have this when you were ready. I said, I just had to wait until you were. He took it with both hands. He opened it slowly. And he looked at the watch a long time without picking it up, without saying a word, without moving at all, wearing the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't known he had waited his whole life to receive. I nodded once, and I went back inside, and I closed the door behind me. Some moments carry enough weight on their own. A man does not need to add his to them. Through the kitchen window, I watched him. He stood exactly where I had left him, holding the cedar box in both hands, looking down at his father's watch. The October light fell across him, and across the fresh paint on the fence, and across the yard that had been his when he was small. He did not move for a long time. I did not go back out. I made coffee instead, and let him have the porch, and the morning, and the watch, and whatever a man needs to do with all of it in his own time. And that is nearly all of it. But before I let you go, there is one thing I have carried this entire story to say to you, and it is time I said it plainly. I turned 77 last month. Margaret made a cake. It was genuinely terrible. She is exceptional at a great many things, and baking is not among them, a fact she is well aware of, and which did not stop her. I ate 2 pieces. She looked appropriately pleased with herself. I tell you this because I want you to understand what my life looks like now, a little over a year after that night at the Four Seasons. It looks like terrible cake, eaten gladly. It looks like coffee on the back porch before the day asks anything of me. It looks like a painted fence, a mockingbird in an oak tree, and the quiet of a house a man lives in because he chose to not, because he hasn't worked out how to leave. It looks like enough. I have spent a while since that October morning thinking about what I would say to you if I were to say one true thing, not the legal details, or the strategy, or who won. The thing underneath all of it, the part that actually mattered. This was never a story about revenge. It was not about money, or lawyers, or winning. It is about something that every man who has ever been quietly dismissed, managed, set aside, made to feel like an inconvenience will recognize at a level below words. Most of the men I know, my age, men who served, who worked with their hands for 40 years, who built something for a family and asked little back, carry the same blind spot. They understand, all the way to the bone, what it means to be useful. They have spent their lives proving it. What they never once stop to ask is what they are worth on the days that usefulness isn't visible to anyone. I was one of those men for a long time. I raised my grandson, funded his company, and drove 4 hours every month to leave groceries and an envelope of cash. And in all those years, I never asked whether the people I did it for saw me as worth anything beyond what I could provide. I told myself that was selflessness. I was wrong. It was avoidance. As long as I never asked the question, I never had to sit with the answer. The people who take advantage of men like me, and they know exactly what they are doing, do not succeed because we are foolish. They succeed because we were taught, young, to measure our worth by what we produce, to believe, somewhere below thinking, that a man who stops being useful stops deserving, to quietly accept whatever seat we are handed by the people we spent our lives building up. I had been seating myself at table 14 for years, before anyone else ever thought to do it, and I had been calling it humility. There comes a moment, if you are still paying attention, when you realize the people around you have already decided what you are worth. They filed the assessment and moved on. and you are left with a choice. You can accept their number and spend whatever time you have left fitting yourself inside it. Or you can decide, quietly, that your worth was never theirs to set. There is a difference between being humble and being invisible, between not needing to stand at the center of things and accepting you have no rightful place among them at all. You are allowed to know what you are worth, not by demanding applause or handing over the ledger of your sacrifices as a bill come due. I mean something quieter and far more important. The simple refusal to accept, as settled fact, that the people who matter most to you are entitled to your presence when it serves them, and free to set it down when it doesn't. The decision to treat your own dignity as a fixed point, not because you are important in any grand way, but because you are a person, and a person is non-negotiable, and no one gets to revoke that without your consent. I learned that too late, and just in time. Both of those are true at once. I believe God puts certain men on this earth to hold things together, to be the ones who stay when others leave, who build without asking for the credit, who sacrifice in silence and call it nothing. And I believe He sees every mile driven, every dollar given without ceremony, every evening spent alone in a kitchen that once held more people than it does now. He has a way of settling what the world leaves unsettled in His own time, by means no scheme can anticipate and no lawyer can draw up. Thomas's watch is where it belongs now. Some promises, kept faithfully enough, find their way home. If you are 60 or 65 or 77, and you have been sitting at your own table 14 longer than you can comfortably account for, I am not going to tell you what to do about it. I am only going to tell you that you are not the only one who got here, that getting here does not mean you failed, and that the fact you are still paying attention is the only qualification a man needs to change direction. My name is James Hargrove. Most people call me Jim. I am a retired Army colonel, a widower, and a grandfather who spent years raising a boy and nearly lost himself in it. I live in Savannah, Georgia. I drink my coffee on the back porch. I painted my fence last November, took my time with it, and I am glad I did. If any part of this was worth your time, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from. And tell me about the man in your life who has been Jim, the one who showed up quietly, who built everything worth having, who never once sat at the right table but made sure everyone else had a seat. He deserves to know that you see him. Send this to him today. You don't need to explain it. He will know what it means.